Hello again. Welcome back to Portland Community College Computer Information Systems 121. I'm Al Zimmerman, and this video is part 3 of our Introduction to Databases. In this video, we're going to be starting the database development process. We're going to be using our old friend, the System Development Lifecycle, and we're going to apply it specifically to databases. If you've seen the earlier videos in this series, you know that an SDLC is a series of phases where you do unique kinds of work. You listen to your customers using your support techniques and your talents in support. Then you analyze the situation and you come up with a succinct description of the problem to be solved. You design a solution to it, you build that solution, and then you deploy it to your customers and you support their use of it. The system development lifecycle is also useful for developing databases. In this case, in the analysis phase, we're going to concentrate on describing the customer's data in a clear and unambiguous way that helps us confirm our analysis with the customer. We're going to use the customer's names for things, and we're just going to try and make sure we understand the customer completely. In the design phase, we're going to build the components of the database that we saw in the earlier videos. We're going to build the tables, we're going to decide what the attributes are, we're going to create the queries and the forms and the reports. And we're going to essentially create the database. Now, in a simple database like we're using with Microsoft Access, the design and the build are pretty much the same thing. In a larger environment, your design is separate from your building, and you always do a design phase separate from your implementation. In any case, I want to make sure you understand that there's a lot more to the analysis phase than what we're going to be talking about here. You have to identify the requirements the customer has about what kind of information do they want, what form do they want it in. That helps you build your queries and your reports. We're going to focus on just describing the customer's data and making sure we get that accurate. We'll leave the other stuff for your subsequent courses in database design and development. Let's talk about describing the customer data. We're going to use two tools in particular. The first one is called a business rule. The second one is called an entity relationship diagram. These two things are different sides of the same coin, and you'll use them at the same time. One describes the situation in simple language. One draws a picture. Let's see how that works. Now, a business rule comes in many forms. If you've ever worked in a franchise or you've worked at a very regulated kind of business, there are all sorts of rules. We do certain activities at certain times. You talk to the customers in this kind of language. You wear a uniform. All those kind of rules that help you run the business the way it's intended to be. We are going to focus on those business rules that describe data. Just a subset of the business rules. And they're kind of a very structured format, which we're going to talk about now. So how do you write a business rule for the purposes of this course? Well, first of all, you get in close with the customers. You interview them, you listen to them, you do ride-alongs, you observe them in their natural habitat. Then you identify the things that are important to them. And by things, I mean both those things in the physical world. Like, say we're analyzing a real estate business. The homeowners, the people, and the houses, the homes. So those are two of the things. Another thing that's very important in a real estate business is this abstract concept called a mortgage, which is an agreement between a bank and a person. And it gets very complicated. Your job as an analyst is just to write all these things down so you get a complete list. Then you find out, how do these things work together? How are they related? What are their characteristics? And you make simple sentences in clear, consistent, and customer-oriented vocabulary. Why do you use the customer's vocabulary? So you can go back to the customer and say, is this right? Is this the way it's supposed to work? And they can read what you've written and say, I recognize that. Yes, that's true. Or, oh no, not the way you've written it. It's more like this. So this is part of the conversation between you, the analyst, and the customer. Okay. These kinds of business rules always come in pairs. Let's see an example. So, talking about peoples and houses. People own 0 or many houses. This is a strangely formatted sentence. But we're going to see how this kind of sentence makes it very easy to organize the data later. Let's break it down. People own houses, right? But not everybody owns a house, so somebody could own 0 houses. Some people own more than one house, maybe 2 houses, a beach house, a cabin. So some people own more than one house. So we summarize all of that by writing down this very simple sentence: people own 0 or many houses. There's always 2 sides to every relationship, as every psychologist and every daytime television talk show host would tell you. Relationships are a two-way street. So let's look at it from the other direction. A house belongs to one or many people. One person can buy a house, or sometimes it's 2 people in a marriage. A married couple buys a house, or just friends. Or sometimes people get together and buy a house in a collective. So to summarize the relationship between people and houses, we look at it from one direction and we say people own 0 or many houses. Houses belong to one or many people. Another business rule that comes up. In the United States, we have something called a Social Security number, an SSN, a Social Security number, and that's assigned to each citizen as they are born or as they become a citizen. So one half of the rule that describes the relationship between people and Social Security numbers is a person has one and only one Social Security number. You don't get to have many of them, and you have to have at least one. The other way around is a Social Security number belongs to one and only one person. 2 people can't have the same Social Security number. Now, these are the rules, but we all know that Social Security numbers aren't very well regulated and they get all sorts of problems in them. But this is the idea. This is the ideal. A person has one and only one Social Security number. A Social Security number belongs to one and only one person. So here's an example of 2 business rules. Each business rule is a pair. Now, as you saw earlier, what we're looking for as we organize our database is we want to identify the entities so that we can turn them into tables. We want to identify the attributes or the characteristics of the entities so we can put them in the columns. And we want to identify the relationships so that we can see how all of this stuff connects up. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the business rules and we're going to analyze them to see if we can identify what the entities, the attributes, and the relationships are. Now at this point, the customer doesn't really care. They don't really care how we organize the data as long as we get them the information they want. We care because we have to build this database and it has to be efficient and effective and it has to be organized well to get the information that we're looking for. So we have to take these business rules, which we verified with the customer, and turn them into entities, attributes, and relationships. So we're going to use a few rules of thumb. We're going to look for the nouns in the business rule, and we're going to see if these might be the entities and attributes. We're going to look for the verbs in the business rules, and we're going to use those for our relationships. And finally, we're going to look for adjectives, and that's going to tell us something called optionality and something called cardinality. optionality and cardinality. We'll see what those things are in a minute. So we're going to look at these business rules and try to pull out the nouns, the verbs, and the adjectives. Here's an example. So here's our rule: people and houses, houses and people. So let's see, what are the nouns in this particular business rule? There's one, people. So that's our candidate for an entity, and I'm going to notate people, entities, using these two boxes. You'll see why in a little bit. Then I'm going to look for more nouns. There's another noun over here, houses. Houses. So let's say that's an entity. Let's model that as a house. Notice that the entities are singular nouns. Person, house. Okay. Now we said the verbs are the relationships. So let's see, what verbs do we have in here? Well, there's one. People own houses. So the way I'm going to show relationships is I'm going to draw a line that connect the two entities, and I'm going to label it with that verb. A person owns a house. You can kind of scan across from person to owns to house, and you can almost read that business rule right off the diagram. And again, relationships are a two-way street, so let's look at the other half of the business rule and see what the other verb is. There it is, belongs to. We already have the line, so all we have to do is just add to the label. And so we show the other direction, the other relationship, the other side of the same relationship rather, this way, owns or belongs to. So if you read the diagram from right to left, a house belongs to a person. You read it from left to right, a person owns a house. Now we're going to look for adjectives because we need this thing called optionality and cardinalities. Just stay with me here. We'll figure out why in a minute. So let's find the adjectives in this business rule. Well, there's an adjective phrase, zero or many. So we're going to translate that zero or many adjective phrase into a strange looking line ending that looks like this. And we're going to depict the optionality and cardinality of the relationship, at least this end of the relationship, using those symbols. We'll talk about what those symbols mean in just a minute. Then let's look for another adjective. One or many. One or many people. That's going in the other direction, so we'll put it at the other end of the line, and that looks like this. So the optionality and cardinality of the relationship from house to person is shown at that end of the line. This is an important thing. The end of the line that shows the particular part of the relationship is always at the end of the line. A person owns zero or many houses. A house belongs to one or many persons. So here we've got a business rule that's written in very simple language, and we've got a diagram that shows exactly the same entities and relationships in the form of an entity relationship diagram. There's lots of different formats for entity relationship diagrams. In fact, in our course materials, you'll see 2 or 3 or 4 of them. Entity relationship diagrams are a pretty old notation, and there are all sorts of variations. In your homework, please use this form of the notation, using these rectangles and these line endings and these kind of labels. Okay? Okay, so I said we were going to deal with the optionality and the cardinality thing, so let's go back and take a look at that. What is that stuff? Well, simply, optionality refers to whether something is optional or not. Do I have to have it? Or is it optional? If I say a person has 0 houses, that means, well, they don't have a house. So if something is optional, I can have 0 of them, or I can have 1 of them, or I can have many. It doesn't really matter. Now the cardinality is where that number becomes important. The cardinality is just a fancy way of saying how many of these entities are we talking about? Is there 1 of these entities, or are there more? The way we show optionality and cardinality in the entity relationship diagram is by using those line endings. There's only a small set of them, and they're easy to memorize, and I'd like you to do that. You'll have to be able to regurgitate these things in the quizzes, and more importantly, when you go in and you look at somebody's entity relationship diagram, you're going to want to instantly recognize what they're talking about. So, let's start with the first kind. If you just have a line, I don't really know how many we're talking about here. It's easier if you actually are saying I have one to actually show one. And you basically just draw one on the line. You put a bar on the line. If you're trying to show one and only one, you just use two bars. One and only one. If you want to say 0 or 1, then it's you just draw a 0 on the line. It's self-evident. There's a 0 or there's a 1. It gets a little weirder when you try to show the concept of many. And think about it this way. You have many things, so you have many line endings. People call this the crow's foot notation. Although a student of mine once remarked that it looked more like a cardinal's foot. Get it? Cardinality, cardinal's foot. He was pretty funny. You can combine many with 0 and 1 like this. If you have one or many, then you put one or you put many. If you have 0 or many, then you put a 0 on the line and you put the many sign there. These 6 line endings, don't worry about the one in the beginning, these 6 line endings are the only ones you need. It doesn't make any sense to say 0, 1, or many. You can't have all 3. Doesn't make any sense to have 0 or 1 and only 1 because it's only 1. So use one of these 6. 1, 1 and only 1, 0 or 1, many, 1 or many, or 0 or many. Now you may notice at this point that we only have 3 numbers in database analysis. We're kind of simple that way. We have 0, which means that it's optional. I don't need to have this entity in my relationship. Of course, if your relationship is only 0, then you don't even bother modeling it. I mean, if people don't have unicorns, a person can have 0 unicorns, then there's no reason for you to model that relationship at all. 0 always appears in combination with one of the other 2. Now, when you say, I need one of these things, that's important. That means it's not optional. 0 or 1, you're saying, well, I could have it, but if I have one, I only have one. As we saw earlier, if you say 1 and only 1, you're saying, I need one of these things, and I must have one of these things. And finally, once you're past 1, whether it's 2 or 3 or a million, it doesn't matter. Why? Because when I'm constructing my database, it's important for me to know, well, do I have to just store one of these entity relationships? Or do I have to store many of these entity relationships? The difference between 1 and many is important. The difference between 5 and 6 is not. Once I can store 2, I can store as many as I like. Modern databases don't have that kind of limitation. Well, it's very large. So we only have 3 numbers in database analysis. 1, 0, or many. Okay, so we've got entities, we've got relationships. What about the attributes? I mean, do you remember the rule of thumb? Nouns indicate entities or attributes? Well, what's with that? What's the difference between an entity and an entity and an attribute when I'm looking at a business rule? Well, like so many situations, you got to see an example to understand it. Well, here's our first rule. People own 0 or many houses. A house belongs to 1 or many people. Let's look at a second rule. Houses have 1 or many bedrooms. Now what this implies means that it doesn't make sense to have a house without a bedroom. I mean, one of the main reasons you have a house is in order to sleep there. Now on the other side of things, a bedroom belongs to one and only one house. You can't swap bedrooms between houses. And frankly, it doesn't make sense to have a house without a bedroom. And it doesn't make sense to have a bedroom without a house. You do have one-room apartments, and you do end up sleeping in that room. But you might as well call it a bedroom. Notice that you may find situations in your analysis of the situation where this rule isn't exactly the right rule, and you and your customer will sort that out. But let's work on this rules just to understand the question, well, is bedroom an entity or an attribute? And again, it depends. It depends on what kind of information do you need. So, for example, let's say we just need simple information. We're doing a real estate database. In that case, it only matters, does the house have one bedroom? Does it have 3 bedrooms? Does it have 5 bedrooms? The realtor will show the house off. They don't need to describe it in any more detail than that. So at that point, you could probably just store the number of bedrooms as an attribute of the house. And this is the notation I'd like you to use when you're listing the attributes of an entity. The entity name goes in the top rectangle, and the list of attributes goes in the lower rectangle. Now, if you want to store more information about that particular thing, about bedrooms, let's say you need to store the complex information needed by an interior designer. You need to store the wall color, the window treatments, the floor coverings, whether it was created for a little girl or an older teenage boy. You have to store a lot of extra information about that bedroom. Well, then it's probably a good idea to model that bedroom as its own entity, and then establish the relationship between the house and the bedroom using our other methods. Notice that an attribute has a relationship to its own entity. It's a simple ownership relationship. It's an implied relationship. Okay, let's review the vocabulary terms that we ran into in this video. Those weird ones, the cardinality and the optionality, are the ones you're going to have to remember. Cardinality is how many are we talking about? Optionality is, do I need it or not? Is it optional or not? Business rule is a pair of simple sentences that describe the customer's data in our situation. And an entity relationship diagram, or an ERD, is a graphical way of representing a business rule. In your homework, you're going to analyze some information from a customer, and you're going to write business rules, and then you're going to draw entity relationship diagrams that match these business rules. Okay, that's it for this video. In the next one, we're going to make the transition from analysis to design using a tool called the schema. A schema is a simple way of representing all of the entities and all of the attributes and all of their relationships in the database before you start throwing them into tables. Okay, I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much.